All right, well, I'm next. So if you'll turn to Deuteronomy chapter 1 with me. Deuteronomy chapter 1. I just want to share some things that God taught me over this weekend while I was sitting on the top of a mountain.
It was amazing. It was beautiful. It was beautiful.
In Deuteronomy chapter 1, I'm just going to share with you a few things, 4 quick points about how you know when you've been on the mountain too long. And it's funny because even before I went on this retreat this weekend, I was reading Deuteronomy chapter 1, and I come across the verse that I'll show you in a second, where God says, Moses, you've been on this mountain too long. And I'm like, God, I haven't even got there yet. It's not fair. Like, I'm at the mountaintop. So, but anyway, how can you tell when you've been on the mountain too long? Starting in verse 1 of chapter 1 of Deuteronomy, I'm just going to read through this first passage with you guys. Number 1, how can you know when you're on the mountaintop too long? Is when your past victories define you. And I see that in this passage because I don't necessarily think that Moses was doing this himself, but I think that the children of Israel were doing this. Because Moses explains, this is after he defeated this king in this place, and after he defeated this king in this place. And that's kind of their reference point. That's how they know, okay, it was after this. Oh, it was when we defeated that guy, when we conquered that thing, when we did this great thing. And their past victories defined them. That's what they were known by, that their past victories. And see their focus shift from God's glory to their own. Nowhere in here did they mention how God had defeated Sihon, the king of this place. How God had defeated Og, the king of Bashan. It's all about, after we defeated these people, and then these people, and then these people, and then these people, and oh wow, look how great we are. We're so awesome. Like, everybody knows how powerful Israel is. Their focus had shifted from God's glory to their own. Because let me tell you, you can read on in chapter 2, where Moses is reviewing with them how that God had defeated them. And it's very evident that the children of Israel were scared to death of these people. Scared to death. And God had to talk them into defeating these people. He had to talk them into going to battle and saying, don't worry, I've got you. You're doing what I told you to do, so I've got the victory. I'm going to fight for you. But the children of Israel, once they're on this side of it, they're on the mountaintop, they kind of stay too long because their past victories start to define them. The glory is shifted to them from God. And then they miss out on God's best. How do you know when you're on the mountain too long is they miss out on God's best, which is here at the end of what we just read. God has to tell them, look, you're not even to the promised land yet. You're camping out, you're content to camp out right on the edge of God's best for you. And so often we do that as Christians. We're camping out, we're in our little tents, and right on the edge of the cliff, and God just wants us to take that one more step of faith into the great unknown and see the unbelievable, awesome experience that He has for us, the unbelievable promised land that He has for us. But see, the children of Israel were too content to stay on this mountaintop. God has to tell them in verse 8, see, I have set the land before you. Go in and take possession of the land. And they weren't even there yet, but they were too long on the mountaintop. So, number 1, how do you know when you're too long on the mountain? It's when your past victories define you. Number 2 is when your responsibilities overwhelm you. And that's where I see the next passage in verse 9 through 13. So Moses says, you know what, it's just getting too much for me. I can't handle all the responsibility myself. So he starts to delegate. And I feel like the application for us and what God told me is when your responsibilities overwhelm you, you've been on that mountaintop too long. When you become too controlling and you want to oversee every detail, you've been on the mountaintop too long. When you don't know how to delegate to your leaders, when you don't know how to shift responsibility and shift weight to others, you've been on the mountaintop too long. because it kind of rolls into that first point of all that glory is focused on yourself, and you feel so important in your role, your job, and your title. And that's not where God wants you. He can't use that. Remember, God used the children of Israel, and what Corbin just finished saying is God uses the weak ones, the broken ones, and He gets the glory. So, how you know you're on the mountaintop too long is, number one, your past victories define you. Number two, your responsibilities overwhelm you. Number three, your own abilities weaken you. And I find this in chapter 1, verse 26 through 28. But basically, let me give you the history of 19 through 25. Is they leave Mount Horeb into the great wilderness, and they come to the land of Kadesh Barnea. They're still not where God wants them to be. They're just on the edge. And God says to send out some spies. They send out the spies into the wilderness. You know the story. They come back with huge fruits of the land, and everybody's excited. But then the majority of the 12 that were sent out say, there's no way. These people are giants. They're going to crush us. There's giants all over the land. We are not. The cities are walled so high. They're fortified. There's no way that we're going to be able to conquer these people. And verse 26 says, so you know when you're on the mountaintop too long is when your own abilities weaken you. Because your fear says you can't do what you can do. See, this is God's what land? God's promised land. He's promised it to them. He's already proven, as they've decided to take the glory for themselves, He's already proven that He can fight for them. They defeated the king Og, and they defeated the king Bashan of all these kings of all these cities in the wilderness. So they know that their God can fight for them. But see, their fear, the report of those 12, 10 of the 12, is a report of fear that says you can't do what God's promised you to do. And then pride says you can do what you can't do. And this is all tied up in that third point of your own abilities weaken you, because you don't believe that you can do what God's promised. And then you believe that you can do stuff that God hasn't promised. And we find that in verses 41 through 46 of chapter 1. Basically, Caleb and Joshua get up and say, no, God's promised the land. God's promised the land. We can do this. And so then, in verse 41, God is kind of talking to them. He says, then you answered me the days you remained there. So basically, they thought they could do something when God wasn't with them. So, how do you know when you're on the mountain too long? Is when your own abilities weaken. And then lastly, your rebellious sins trap you. You're on the mountaintop when your own rebellious sins trap you. And we find this in chapter 2. These group of men who decided to go up and fight the Amorites without God in their midst. God makes a very, very, very stern promise to them, which we'll get to. But at the beginning of chapter 2, we see verses 1 through 3. Then so again, they're at the top of the mountain. They come down off the mountain. They're too afraid to go fight. And then they decide to go fight when God's not with them. They get defeated. They get whipped, like George got whipped yesterday. And then they start just going around the mountain. And God says, no, you are missing out on my best for you. You're traveling around the mountain, but this is not what I want. See, their routines, their habits controlled them. They're just so content. They're complacent in where they were. And then you hang on to what's hindering you. You see, the reason that they were wandering around this mountain is because God would not allow them to cross the river and to go into that land until every single person had died that went up to fight against the Amorites without God being there. And we find that in verse 14 through 18. And the time for our leaving Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the brook Zered was how many years? 38 years. 38 years the children of Israel missed out on the promised land. They missed out on God's best. Why? The verse tells us, until the entire generation, that is, the men of war, had perished from the camp, as the Lord had sworn to them. For indeed the hand of the Lord was against them, to destroy them from the camp, until they had perished. Verse 16, soon as all the men of war had perished, and were dead from among the people, the Lord said to me, today, you are to cross the border of Moab at Ar. That's when the victories finally started to happen. Is when they were able to let go of what was hindering them. So, when you come off your mountaintop and learn to trust God again, you see that your next peak is higher. But until you can do that, things to think about is, are you letting your past victories define you? Are you letting your responsibilities overwhelm you? Are you letting your own abilities weaken you? And are you letting your own rebellious sins trap you? Because those are your 4 hints. Those are your 4 alerts that you've been on your mountaintop too long. And that's what God had to teach me this weekend about all these different things, about decided church, about my own life personally, about coming off the mountaintop and moving on. And interestingly, I'll close with this, back in chapter 1, if you'll turn back there. Interestingly enough, you come off the mountain, what direction do you go? When you're coming off the mountain, what does that mean you're headed towards? You're headed towards the valley. And it says that in verse 7. Turn and take your journey and go to the hill country. All right, is a hill bigger or smaller than a mountain? Smaller. It's a lower peak, so they're going down. Go to the hill country of the Amorites, to all their neighbors, to the hill country, and then to the lowlands, and then by the sea coast. So they've gone from the mountaintop all the way down to the sea level, the seaboard, whatever you want to call it. So yes, you're going to go through the valley, but that valley is going to take you to the next peak, which is God's best, which is where He wants you, which is higher than the previous peak. It's higher than the mountaintop you're sitting on, but you can't see that until you come off. You can't see that until you're down in the valley. And you see, oh wow, okay, I see where God's going. And so that's just what God had to teach me this week about staying too long on the mountaintop.